Holly Conway is a life coach and licensed professional counselor practicing in Houston, Texas. Holly will be giving us her take on the topic of stress. So if you guys want to go ahead and get your clap emojis ready and help me welcome to the digital stage, Holly Conway.
So really happy to be here. Like Anderson said, my name is Holly and I work in Houston normally. I have evacuated for the hurricane, but I work in Houston at a place called Modern Therapy and Human HQ. And I'll tell you a bit more about them later as we get started. So excited / intimidated / I don't even know the other word to talk about stress this morning because 2020, like how do we even start to put it together in our minds, the amount of stress we've all been through. But as I was kind of thinking about the talk today and the audience and what we were thinking about, how can we creatively talk about stress and how can we say some new things about stress? I took up the invitation to practice my creative skills and to write something. I was actually an English major in college and I haven't written in a while. And so it was really fun to sit down last week and like really write my story when it comes to stress. So I was, contemplating like, oh, should I get this memorized? Should I try to just like do it off the cuff? But I'm like, no, this is about stress. Don't stress yourself out. So I'm going to read you guys a bit of my writing. And this is my stress story. I remember it clearly. It was an ungodly early hour on a Friday morning. I was getting to work early for another exciting day of spreadsheets and checklists. Ugh. I was in my second year of working as a guidance counselor at a big public high school in Houston, and I was a decade into learning firsthand how hard and thanklessly public school educators work. I was half awake because we got to work at 6 a.m. every day, so getting there early meant arriving about 5:30 a.m. I shuffled exhaustively towards my windowless cell of an office. I reached through the door of my waiting area and walked into the dark room. As soon as I opened the door and stepped into the dark office, I noticed a lump in the middle of the floor, surrounded by 3 police officers. 3. I knew these officers well. I knew them well because they almost daily hauled bloody and brawling teens into my office from one of the daily fights in the hallway or the cafeteria. I lethargically stepped over the lump on the floor and looked back to see a young boy laying face down on the ground, handcuffs behind his back. The 3 officers were standing above him, yet having a casual conversation about their plans for the weekend. I asked them what he had done, and one replied, "He was up here selling drugs. We know he'd show up here eventually, so we were waiting for him this morning." I knew these officers. They were doing the job they'd been told to do. Their hearts were probably even in the right place, of wanting to protect and serve their community, to keep kids safe at school. I couldn't see the kid on the floor, but I probably knew him too. His heart might have even been in the right place, of thinking he needed to provide for his family or feeling like he had no other option but to turn to illegal means. So many personal and societal complexities swirled in my mind as I stepped into my windowless cell of an office. I plopped in my chair defeatedly, and I couldn't help but think, what are we doing here? What am I doing here? Is this really the have an impact on young lives job I thought I'd signed up for? I left work later that day, the boy from the morning still heavy on my mind. But my actual job was a lot of checklists and spreadsheets to make certain we were in compliance with state and federal education regulations. I dragged myself to my car with a heavy heart, a mind full of questions and complexities, a body exhausted from the mind-numbing monotony of the job, and headed straight to a friend's house. I had agreed to help her with an online class she was taking. I showed up to her house, and she quickly threw the assignment description at me, told me some of the specifics of it, and headed across the street to drink wine with her neighbors. I worked thanklessly on her paper, researching, writing, and rewriting until it was up to standards I would have for any assignment I had turned in myself. She was kind enough, and she would come sit with me for a few minutes each hour, thumb through some papers, pretend like she was working, and try to add her 2 cents. But it was clearly I was doing this assignment for her. I hauled myself to my car about midnight that night, and when I finally made it into bed, I was fully spent, but equal parts confused, frustrated, irritated, and feeling underutilized yet exhausted at the same time. Fast forward a few years. I finished up the last few steps I needed to become a fully licensed therapist and coach, and I spent many hours in my windowless cell of an office searching for jobs that were far more aligned with me than the spreadsheet checklist monotony. I've left my job at the fight-ridden public high school and started to work at Modern Therapy in Human HQ. Modern Therapy is a private practice that focuses on offering coaching and therapy services to Houston's high-functioning professionals, young professionals, and creatives. And Human HQ is our community passion project that curates small groups for people who really value kindness and connection and want to meet more people who have those same values. It's another early morning, Saturday this time, and I'm walking up to our beautiful office in the middle of the Heights. Literally, the sun is shining, the birds are singing, and there are literal butterflies swarming the landscape. Butterflies, guys. I walk in and there's some vibey, cool indie acoustic pop music playing. The sun is streaming through all the windows that line the plants and hitting the plants in our hallways. There's delicious coffee brewing. And many of my coworkers were there on an early Saturday morning because they're there working on passion projects and creative outlets. I step into my impeccably designed office, curl up with my laptop, and start working with one of my coworkers for one of our upcoming events. We work for hours, churning out ideas, editing, re-editing. We work for most of the day, actually. I walk back to my car happy and satisfied at the work that we'd accomplished that day, knowing it would resonate with the people who would come to our event. I rushed home to make a call with a coach that I'd been working with out in California. She had challenged me to push myself out of my comfort zone and throw a dinner party at my house that night. Dinner parties, stressful. We had a call to go over last minute details, and I walked into my house. We had a great call. I turned some music on, lit some candles, started cooking and decorating for the party that night. As my friends and coworkers trickled in and out of the party, we sat around a beautiful table I had set, eating food I had made, and I couldn't help but feel full and happy. The contrast between these two stories is obvious, and I'm sure my brain has hyperbolized and elaborated both extremes, but the difference in my life satisfaction is palpable. So I wanted to share these stories with you guys because I'm just a person like everybody else. I'm no one famous. I'm no one special. And I felt like these stories really embodied when we think about kind of real life, everyday stress and the difference of what it feels like to live a life full of kind of monotonous, low grade stress that can really, really start to wear on you versus the kind of stress that you feel when you're really working towards a life that's more in line with your purpose and your values. So I'm going to pull up some slides to go over some things here. Perfect. So whenever we think about the stories that I was writing, the main morals that I was thinking through was, man, there was such a loud voice telling me this or not this whenever I was going through these various situations in my life. And that's something that I really, really encourage all of my clients I work with, my friends, when we talk about stress, is if we can really, really tune into that internal voice that's whispering or sometimes shouting attention whenever it's whispering to you, like, this is it for me. Or sometimes it's a really loud shout saying, not this is not it for me. One of the main things when I was thinking about stress is the idea that we really get to choose. And if we all think about the year of 2020, there's no way that we can get rid of stress. I wish so badly that I could walk away in the next 15 minutes and take away everybody's stress. I wish you could have a toolbox and a lot of things in your mind that would say wow, I never really experience stress anymore. I wish so bad. Makes me think I have a friend who's a beautician, a hairdresser, and she has a little sign on her station that says, "I'm a hairdresser, not a magician." And I think about that often. If I could do one thing for people, it would be to take away stress from their lives. And unfortunately, we're not able to do that, but we do get to choose what kind of stress we focus on in our lives. We can think about stress as not necessarily something to be fully avoided, but instead it's something to be used as a tool to give us information about ourselves, about our dreams, and about our needs. If you ask most people what are the main stressors in their lives, they'll tell you some version of work or relationships. Work stress might look like job dissatisfaction, trouble with a boss, trouble being a boss and leading people, really a lot of burnout. Relationships dissatisfaction a lot of times looks like trouble within our romantic relationships, trouble within our families, dating, trouble within our friend groups. So if you talk to people long enough, you'll say, man, a lot of people's stress really boils down to some version of their vocational or their work satisfaction or their relationship satisfaction. And again, as much as I wish I could take that away for people, that's always going to be kind of humming in the background. So instead of thinking, can we take that away? Instead, we want to focus on the power of the reframe. And if you've ever been to therapy or talked with a therapist, a reframe is one of the most powerful tools that I use all the time and that a lot of people find really helpful. And it's that idea of, can I look at this same situation from a new perspective, right? So when I'm feeling a moment of stress, can I think of this stress instead of this terrible thing that I need to push down and take away and try to not feel? Can I instead invite a bit of curiosity around this stress and think, okay, what is this stress trying to make me feel? So really remembering the power of the reframe next time you feel some inevitable stress. If you do much research or looking about stress, most things will tell us that, stress causes heart attacks and sickness and belly fat. And it was tempting to go that route when thinking about stress. Like, okay, should we talk about like how stress can make you sick? But we all have Google, we all have BuzzFeed, we all have HuffPost lists, right? And those things are wonderful. They have great tips that you can look up, and they'll give you a lot of really good tips about grounding and centering, having some tea, taking a nap when you need it, some meditation, wonderful, wonderful tips. But when I really think about what I hear from my clients, what I hear from my friends, what I feel in my own life, I'm not really necessarily quite worried about heart attacks and heart disease and all those things quite yet. I'm sure there will be a season in my life where I will. But what I really do worry about, and what I know most people worry about, is loss of joy, feeling purposeless in their life, having little to no vitality in their work, a lot of loneliness and isolation, especially in our time, and a lot of boredom. And those are the kind of effects from stress that I feel like most of us really feel more often in our life than necessarily worrying about the super physical, heart attacks and that kind of thing. Not to say that it's not real, because it definitely is. But when we really think about these deeper psychological effects of stress, these are the things that I'm like, if we can help people with this, if I can help myself with this, these will be the things that we can really start to make a difference in our life. One of the people who's doing some research in this area, if you've never seen Kelly McConaughey's TED Talk on stress, she does some really, really good insight and some research about this idea of reframing our relationship with stress. She's a health psychologist, and she's done lots of research that says stress alone doesn't actually make us sick. It's being stressed about stress that makes us sick. One of her studies has found that your stress beliefs are actually, I think it's the 15th leading cause of death. So it's not necessarily that you're stressed, it's the fact that you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed, stress makes me sick, I've got to get rid of the stress. That actually makes us stress. It's the stress about stress that tends to make us sick. Another great resource is a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And one of their points in there is that the animals don't get ulcers, right? Animals don't have these kind of chronic stress symptoms that we see in a lot of humans. And sometimes it's because the stress response can sometimes become more stressful than the actual stressor. So if you look at the way the animals respond to a stressor, they kind of just biologically respond. But humans, we ruminate and we think and we hyper focus on that stressor. And so their point being, yes, stressors will always be there, but if we can really change that perspective and work on the reframe instead of over focusing on the stressor, then we'll actually have much less effects from stress. So the challenge being, instead of trying to get rid of stress, can you change your relationship with stress? To try to think of stress as a signal. Whenever you're feeling stress in your body, to ask yourself, what is it saying to you? And if you really stop for a moment and pause and think, what is stress? If I was to look it up, what is the definition of stress? Stress is tension, right? Stress is something in the system, whether it be a family system, a friendship system, a work system, your internal system, saying something is off here, something is wrong. It is our body, our mind, our soul alerting us that something is off, something is wrong, and it's asking us to resolve that tension somehow. So when you think of, okay, clearly I'm getting a signal, I need to resolve it somehow. How might I resolve that tension? So a lot of people have heard, of the fight, the flight, or the freeze response whenever we feel a stressor. But there's new research that's talking about there's actually a few more responses to stress, and that's submit and connect. So I think that's super interesting, right? A lot of us know fight, flight, or freeze. Like when we get stressed, we have one of those three reactions. But now we're saying actually there's new reactions to say like some people actually kind of just go limp and have a lot of lethargy and are not really able to find motivation, aren't really able to get off their couch. And then a lot of people really want to connect whenever they feel a stressor. That was the one that really caught my attention. So we'll talk more about connect. So I really wanted to focus of those responses. What are the things that we feel pretty in control of, the more active things? What can we do about stress? What are we in charge of? And really thinking about the fight response and the connect response. Specifically thinking about the fight response. What are we fighting for? That was the main question I kept thinking about in my mind. We have to fight stress no matter what. We're alive, stress will be here, we're never getting rid of it, but we do get to choose what we're fighting for. Reminding ourselves that we're not fighting to live a stress-free existence, but we're fighting to add value and meaning to our lives. Again, I can't stop thinking about 2020 and like, if there's nothing we've learned is that there's so many things out of our control, right? That there's things that are just, they happen and we'll never get rid of them. There will always be stress and disease. People will always be dying. There will always be sickness and sadness and hurt in the world. So if we can really learn to let that hum in the background as we focus on adding value and meaning to our lives, our stress responses will actually go way down. There's a really good reading. My colleague, Dr. Beatrice Craven, who started modern therapy, she was a CreativeMornings speaker, I think a couple of years ago. She sent me this quote a few weeks ago, and it was amazing. She's doing a program through Rice, and the quote talks about how we often confuse being fulfilled with feeling good. And a lot of times those two things can coexist, but that's not necessarily always. That fulfillment can also exist when things are challenging or uncomfortable. And I read that, I was like, that's so true. That's something we've all felt in our bodies, but don't necessarily talk much about, right? That it's like, man, there's this certain time, just the right amount of stress, a certain amount of challenge that can feel really good to us, very fulfilling. Oftentimes people will say that the times when they felt the most fulfilled or when they were doing something that was important to them, not necessarily something that was easy. That the things that we're doing when we're adding value into our lives and doing the things that are important, that's when we get that little hit of fulfillment. I can't help here but think about people who, are really fulfilling their purpose, whether it be in the creative realm or within their vocation, sometimes people in the military, people who are doing something that is definitely not easy, but they're really hitting that sweet spot of fulfillment in their life. So the challenge again being, what if instead of trying to get rid of all stress, we try to add in more eustress to our life? So a lot of times when we think of the word stress, we think of stress, typical stress, like pull your hair out, heart pounding stress. But stress is actually an umbrella term and underneath it, there's eustress and there's distress. So when we think of stress, we're actually usually thinking of distress, the type of stress that causes a lot of anxiety, causes a lot of tension. But there's actually a lot of research that talks about adding in more eustress, the good kind of stress into our body can make us feel more fulfilled and more satisfied with our lives. If we're thinking of how do we add in more eustress to our lives, if you think of your values, thinking, okay, what is really, really important to me in this world? What is, if I only had to focus my time and energy on one or two things, what would that be for me? Some people that's their vocation, some people that's their family, some people that's their health, some people that's a cause they feel passionate about. So really focusing in on what are my values, and if I can work in line with those values, that's how I add in more eustress to my life. And the more eustress I have, the less space I have for distress. Really remembering that the only way to live a stress-free existence is to not care about anything. If you care about something, you will have stress. The stress saying, this is important to me. I really want to do the work and to care about this thing and to nurture it and to bring it to life. So there will be stress in line with that. Kelly Mcconnell, again from her TED Talk, she had a great quote that said, chasing meaning is better than trying to avoid discomfort. right? So when I think of this, right, it's just really like if you picture like your energy pie that you have for the day, you have however many hours worth of energy you have, and you get to spend it in one direction or the other. You can spend it trying to avoid stress and push the stress down, or you can spend it trying to chase meaning and purpose instead of avoiding discomfort. Um, we're not the first people to think about it. There's these two psychologists. They're from like the 1900s, like 1910, I believe, and they were working with rats, poor rats, always. And they went through these studies, and they were noticing that if you give rats just the right amount of stimulation, they actually perform whatever task you've given them optimally. So they say here, if you don't give somebody any kind of stimulation, the rats would just kind of sit there like, okay, like they would just sit there in the corner, not do anything. If they gave the rats too much stimulation, they would run around chaotically, not know any kind of direction, just kind of trying to escape the discomfort all the time. But when they could really find just that perfect amount of stimulation, they noticed that this is when the rats are very focused, they're able to complete their task, that they're having a release of more happiness hormones. And this was super interesting, right? If we can find that optimal arousal zone, we'll also get to optimal performance and optimal focus. And when I saw this graph a few years ago, I was like, I've heard something like this before. And I remembered it was when a few years ago I was getting my yoga teacher training, and we were talking about physical movement. And the teacher at the time said, that if we don't move our bodies, we have a lot of infection, that become stagnant. She gave the visual of a swamp, right? Without any kind of stress, without any kind of movement, without any kind of tension, we become very stagnant. And stagnation is like a swamp, and stagnation breeds infection, whether that's in your physical body, in your spirit, in your mind. Without any kind of stress or movement, we'll get to that place of boredom, underperformance, and stagnation that doesn't feel good to any of us. Again, my girl Kelly McGonigal, she said, stress gives us direct access to our hearts. And it's really, really interesting. Like I said, if you watch her TED Talk, she has a lot of science behind the things that when we have a stress response, what's actually happening in our body. And that a lot of times that if we notice, it's what it's trying to do is to get us to pay attention to what our heart needs and what our life needs. So again, that idea of fighting for fulfillment, but also fighting for connection. So remember, one of the other stress responses that we were finding is to reach out for connection. And as the research is growing in this area, they're noticing that when people have a really strong stress response, they're also releasing oxytocin, which is the happiness hormone. Some people call it the cuddle hormone, which is so cute. So it's whenever you feel oxytocin, it makes you want to be around other people. If you know Simon Sinek, he's a guy who does a lot of work within the area of kind of purpose and really fulfilling work. And he has some really good videos about the release of these different hormones and really finding why you do what you do. And remembering there's no wrong answer for that, but basically all of human behavior is motivated by one of these four hormones. There's endorphins, there's dopamine, there's serotonin, and then the cuddle hormone, oxytocin. So again, that one really caught my attention because I'm like, how interesting that when we're feeling stressed, our body is literally begging us to reach out for help, for support, for connection, to not be in it alone. It's not something that we are just making up. Our body is saying, you need someone in this with you. You need either a mentor or a team. You need to just share this stress with a friend, a family member. So a good thing to remember is I'm feeling stressed. My body is truly asking me to either seek support or to offer support, and that's going to reduce the effects of this stress response. A lot of times, especially in my work with Human HQ, one of our focuses is connection. So I do a lot of time, thinking and reading and researching about connection and experiencing people who want to connect. And it's not always easy, right? That we think like, I want these deep connections in my life. I want these meaningful friendships. I think back to when I was writing these stories about my stress life. And like the difference in how I felt, helping this friend with her online class, that I felt she's a great friend, but kind of used and not very connected and we weren't really working together versus throwing a dinner party at my house, my friends helping me cook, sharing in that moment together, a genuine, authentic connection. So like, how do we get there? How do we help more people feel this really genuine, authentic connections that they're wanting to get? And one of the main things I noticed is that all of us could work on being present in moments more, right? I'm not a phone hater. I'm not a social media hater, but we've all got to do better about sitting around the table and just like staring at our phones instead of actually being with the people around us. And a lot of times, even if it's not staring at our phones, our minds are thinking about, oh, that thing I saw, that post I saw, that comparison that I'm doing in my mind. Am I having as much fun as those other people? The comparison game is pretty constant, and it's really hard for us sometimes to be present in moments with the people that we love. It's a really direct correlation, but to have those authentic connections and how able you are to be present in the moments. Being present is a skill, just like any other skill, right? In our minds, we have to have that muscle that allows us to like, oh, my mind is wandering. I've got to learn how to bring it back here. And that's where things like meditation and mindfulness really, really come into play, of being aware of my mind is wandering. I'm not being here with these people. I'm saying I want an authentic connection. So how can I really be here? Another way to really focus on deep connections is to find gratitude for whatever season of life you're in as you actively work for what you want, right? The comparison game is really, really detrimental to our connections. That I hear so many people say like, oh, that person, like they look really cool on Instagram. Like I wish I knew them, but I'm not cool enough, or I don't do the things that they do. And so they hesitate to reach out. So instead thinking of like, yeah, maybe this person is ahead of me, in their career, or they've done a few more things than I've done. They maybe had a few more shows. They might be a few steps ahead of me on the career ladder, but that does not mean that I can't be grateful for where I am. Maybe I started later. Maybe they had more connections than I did. So the idea of like looking at people and instead of comparing and telling myself I can't reach out for connection, instead like, yeah, like that I really admire what this person is working on, and I'm grateful for where I am. Again, the fighting against comparison and fighting for real connections is really, really important when we're thinking of wanting to connect. Um, I talk to a lot of people, like I said, about this desire. It's one of the most interesting things I think about my work as a therapist, is I kind of get to see behind the curtain of people's lives. And, people think like, oh, I want friends and I want these deep connections. I'm feeling kind of lonely. But sometimes it's the action step of like, oh, cool, like we know how to do that now. We know we need to be present, we need to be grateful, but it comes to the really tangible step of like scheduling it in, making space in your calendar, making sometimes an appointment with somebody, saying we are meeting for dinner next Thursday at 7, or meet me on Zoom next Friday at 8. It's that real. We have to make it real if we really want this in our lives. I actually just finished a great new book. It's called Big Friendship. And it's two women. They're the host of the podcast, Call Your Girlfriend. And it's all about how important friendships and connections are to us, yet how difficult and complex they can be to actually bring into our lives. And this idea of scheduling it in is something that they talk a lot about, that if you really want these deep connections in your life, you have to prioritize them and schedule them in. Another one of the barriers to real connections is vulnerability. We all know that kind of like awkward moment of being with somebody new, and you've kind of gone through the introductory piece, the small talk piece, like cool. And then it gets to that moment of what else can we talk about? And then that's the invitation to be vulnerable, to share something real about your life, to ask a real question about their life, to really lean into that vulnerability if you want these authentic connections. And the loneliness epidemic is very, very real. There's so much research now about how lonely everyone actually is feeling. Even pre-quarantine, the loneliness epidemic was rising, and I can't even imagine the numbers that are going to come after quarantine. So really thinking of, you can be part of that solution, that you can be the one, if you're someone who wants more connection, wants some more support, you can be the one to reach out, make the plans, make the schedule, be vulnerable, because you really look around and you realize almost everyone around you is also wanting those connections. You just might have to be the one to kind of push it forward and make it happen. So, kind of wrapping up, some tips to remember to take away from today, and the tips for inevitable stress, right? Because like we've talked about today, stress is never going to be able to fully go away. But if we can live a more mindful existence, we can be more aware of when we're feeling stressed. And those are kind of buzzwords. I know they're kind of cliche, but if you really think about like, what does mindfulness really mean? I love Headspace. I love Calm. All the meditation apps are fantastic, but you have to be like a meditation rock star to sit by yourself in your room for 5 minutes and meditate. Like, woo, awesome. If you can do that, more power to you. I can't. But what I've really noticed is that if you can really focus on being more mindful in your day-to-day interactions, like we talked about, oh my gosh, I'm on my phone. Let me put my phone away. Oh my gosh, my mind is wandering. Let me focus on what this person is saying. Oh my gosh, I'm wrapped up in comparison instead of being vulnerable with this person. Let me focus on that. Even really focusing on your five senses. Whenever I was thinking about the difference in the two stories I started with, I was like, the main difference in my job satisfaction now and my life satisfaction is that I'm very stimulated by my five senses. I walk into an office that smells good. It has beautiful aesthetic. There's plants and lights. There's good coffee. And before, I would go into an office that was dark and cold. There was no windows. There was no plants. There was no music. So really noticing the difference of like, when am I feeling mindfulness and gratitude in my actual body? When am I being stimulated through my sight and my sounds and my smells? Is a bit more kind of like real life mindfulness. Again, meditation apps, fantastic, but you have to be a rock star. Knowing your personal stress signals can be really, really helpful as well. We're all different. We all have a blueprint within us that is very, very unique to us. So some people feel stress, it might be in your stomach. It might be that you get like kind of a churning stomach. Some people feel a tightness in their chest. Some people feel like their voice kind of goes dry and their throat closes up. Some people feel their jaw clenching. Some people can't sleep. Some people sleep too much. So it really is a really kind of personal cue to you. So knowing what your personal stress signals are can be super helpful to like, oh, I must be stressed. I need to be a little bit curious about this stress, which is remembering that noticing is different than judging. So if you're getting one of those stress signals, it actually kind of like doubles the stress response if then you judge yourself for being stressed. Like we talked about, it's the stress about being stressed that's actually really harmful. So whenever you notice a stress signal, okay, I'm noticing this, I'm feeling stressed, like I'm having one of these stress signals from myself. What might it be trying to tell me? Is it trying to ask me to rest? Is it trying to ask me to connect? Is it trying to ask me to start making a change for more fulfillment in my life? Those are the main takeaways from today, to really think about, okay, I'm having a stress response. What's it trying to tell me? Is it trying to tell me to connect? Is it trying to tell me to fight for more fulfillment? Remembering that stress is not necessarily something to avoid completely, but instead we're trying to fight to add more eustress and more connection in our lives. And finally, remembering that as you're trying to make these changes, trying to change your relationship with stress, that we all have to be flexible and self-compassionate with our expectations. If there's one thing that is more sad to me, is when people want to make a change like this and then it actually ends up adding more stress to their life. And we've all been there, right? It's like, okay, I want to start meditating. I want to start yoga. I want to make a new friend. I want to, start a new creative project. We have this idea of something that's going to, in theory, make our life better. And instead, when we start going down that road, it ends up actually making our life worse because we're really hard on ourselves. We're really stressed out about it. We kind of beat ourselves up and our inner critic gets really, really loud. So instead of going that route, the other route is, okay, how can I try to add in these new ways of being? How can I try to change my relationship with stress in a really flexible, open, and self-compassionate way? I always like to think in my mind of the visual of a symphony, that your life is a symphony, right? And here you are standing on the, I don't even know what it's called, conductor box. You're the conductor of your life. And if you think of like all the different areas of your life, it's like all the different parts of a symphony. And a symphony would not sound good if everything was on like full force all the time. Like it would sound terrible. It wouldn't sound beautiful. And instead, our job as the conductor of our life is to constantly be monitoring and paying attention, like more of this, less of this, more of this, less of this, in a really kind and self-compassionate way. So again, I hope you guys really take away today that stress is inevitable. It's never going to go away, but we really can change our focus on adding more eustress, more stress in line with our values, and more connection to our lives.
Digital claps. Yay,
Oh, I
I
got the
like the
clap
claps,
clap
the digital
sign.
clap.